This is Chapter 10, Nutrients Involved in Energy Metabolism and Blood Health. To begin with, let's just take a moment and review what we talk about when we look at vitamins and minerals. The important components here are that these are things that are required for proper metabolism, but in terms of how these relate to metabolism, energy usage, and consumption, these are not directly providing energy. Please remember that energy comes from the macromolecules that we talked about in previous chapters, things like protein, carbohydrates, and fats, predominantly the carbohydrates and the fats. However, vitamins and minerals are necessary for obtaining energy from those macronutrients. And one way that this occurs is through the function of coenzymes. And a coenzyme is a molecule that combines with an enzyme and that is going to help to activate the enzyme so it can do its job. So please remember that we have enzymes. Enzymes are for the most part proteins. These accelerate the rate of a chemical reaction, and enzymes are required for all of our metabolic reactions. Some enzymes require or are helped by coenzymes, which is a non-enzyme molecule that combines with an enzyme. So to kind of take a look at what this looks like in terms of how this could function in more of really just a schematic to understand it. If you imagine an inactive enzyme, the way enzymes work as a protein in nature, they have these binding sites or active sites on them, and that allows for the compound that's being acted upon to bind. So here we have, if I can get my mouse working, here we have an enzyme. Now this enzyme is in its inactive state, and inactive means it cannot bind with the particular compound that works on. So here the chemical reaction is not going to be taking place. However, in the presence of our coenzyme, which could be a vitamin or a mineral, those coenzymes will actually bind to and activate the enzyme, allowing that activated complex now to bind to the compound, and the chemical reaction can occur. So that's the important functioning of what we would call our coenzymes. Now, some of the different vitamins and minerals we'll be talking about today, for example, the B vitamins, some of the different B vitamins take part in important coenzymes. So the B vitamin thiamine is going to function as a coenzyme called TPP, which is thiamine pyrophosphate. These are the other vitamins that we'll talk about today: riboflavin, niacin, B6, folate, pantothenic acid, biotin, and vitamin B12. And these either function on their own or through some change that's going to allow them to be important. Now this gives an overview of protein metabolism, carbohydrate metabolism, and fat metabolism. So if you remember, fat and carbohydrate, these are really the two main energy sources that we take in our diet. We can get energy from protein through its conversion. Okay. So here we see, for example, that TPP, that is the coenzyme that's created by vitamin thiamine, is important over here in the carbohydrate metabolism. Okay. So all of these function together. All of these different vitamins are going to be important in functioning as coenzymes in order for the body to do its overall functioning. This list, table 10.1, is in your book, and it lists the RDA, for some of these different nutrients. The first few that we're going to talk about are our B vitamins. Right? Then we'll talk about some of the minerals involved. This table will be very important for one of the later assignments. So the B vitamins are especially important for energy metabolism, and the ones that we will talk about have both their B name and also a common name. So the first one that we'll look at is thiamine. Thiamine is vitamin B1. It was the first of the B vitamins to be identified. So this is going to create or be made into TPP, which is that thiamine pyrophosphate, and that's important for carbohydrate metabolism. Now there is a deficiency disease called beriberi, and this is due to a deficiency in thiamine. There are pretty significant symptoms with beriberi, including things like paralysis. This really became problematic in the 19th century when rice was going to be more highly processed. So prior to that, prior to the advent of a lot of machinery and things of that nature, foods were eaten in a much more whole form. All right? So rice, when you grow rice, it actually has a little husk around it. That husk is actually a good source of thiamine. So when rice was removed from the rice, creating what we would call white rice as opposed to like brown or wild rices, that decreases the amount of thiamine or vitamin B1 availability. And one problem that comes from this is a lack of the thiamine leading to beriberi. The good sources for vitamin B1 or thiamine would be things like whole grains, grains that do not have that husk removed, pork, and certain enriched foods. So just taking a quick look at some of the different sources, the RDA for women and men, there's usually some difference in the RDA between women and men. Okay. These are, notice here, these are in milligrams. So this mass-produced whole grain total cereal, which is an enriched and fortified cereal, provides 100% of the RDA for both of these. Now the next is riboflavin or vitamin B2. This is also going to be important in creating coenzymes, specifically the coenzymes FMN, which is flavin mononucleotide, and FAD, flavin adenine dinucleotide. Okay. These are going to be important in terms of energy-producing pathways. One of the important sources is milk is a good source of riboflavin, but interestingly enough, riboflavin is broken down in sunlight, so most milk containers are either a dark color, so an opaque color like a bright yellow, or they're served in cartons as opposed to plastic. There is a deficiency of riboflavin, and this tends to have a very large or profound effect on overall energy production, but because it's so general, there's very little very specific symptomology of riboflavin deficiency. However, there are certain things like sore throat and swollen mucous membranes. And riboflavin, in addition, is very important in the metabolism of other vitamins, which we will talk about as well today. The other vitamins are folic acid, vitamin B6, vitamin K, and niacin. So having a deficiency in riboflavin, one of the reasons it has such a broad kind of deficiency syndrome is because riboflavin is so general and reaching. Right? And if we take a look at the riboflavin and we see what the AI, that is the for women and for men, once again, that whole grain total cereal, because it is enriched and fortified, it has these things added into it. Things like mushrooms, surprisingly, mushrooms have a good amount. So 1 cup of cooked mushrooms gives about 25% of what men would need, and probably about 30% of what females would need. The next vitamin that we'll talk about is one of the B vitamins. Okay. And this is called niacin. Niacin, when we started off this when we started off this course, actually, we had mentioned pellagra, and pellagra is a deficiency of niacin. And at first, it was thought that this might be an infectious disease, but this is actually due to a lack of niacin in the diet. And it is characterized by 4 main symptoms, which are dermatitis, which had problems with the skin, then diarrhea, dementia, and death. Okay, so pellagra is actually quite a problematic disease. Niacin really is 2 different components to it. There is the nicotinamide and the nicotinic acid, which are both converted to active coenzymes. They are important in the metabolism of carbohydrates and in fatty acids for energy. And we'll also see that niacin plays a role in DNA replication. Right? DNA replication is extremely important because if DNA replication doesn't occur properly, cell division can't occur properly. So taking a look at some of our sources, some of the good sources are things that are enriched or fortified, some ready-to-eat cereals, but then from more natural sources, we see this in some of our fish, chicken, once again, those shiitake mushrooms, a plant source, not a plant source, I guess they would be considered plants if we're talking about food, but technically a fungus, right, would also give us niacin. The next of our B vitamins is vitamin B6. This is actually 6 related compounds, and this is part of coenzymes that can really function for more than 100 different enzymes. Right? So this coenzyme can interact with over 100 different enzymes, so it's really going to have very widespread effects. Everything from amino acid metabolism, neurotransmitter synthesis. Neurotransmitters are very important chemicals which allow for communication between neurons as part of cognitive function and normal brain activity. The vitamin B6s are important in carbohydrate metabolism. This would be very important in maintaining blood glucose during exercise because it's going to be important, an important coenzyme for the enzyme that breaks down stored glycogen to glucose. So if you remember, glycogen is our stored form of glucose, and when we are exercising or active, we switch to breaking down glycogen that's stored in the liver and the muscles to glucose, and vitamin B6 is important for that. Vitamin B6 is also important in the synthesis of heme, and we'll talk more about heme at the end of this chapter, but heme is very important in transporting oxygen in blood. It has a role in immune function, right? As well as being important in the synthesis of other nutrients. Right? So vitamin B6 is important in metabolizing or making things like niacin, folate, and also carnitine. Right? One of the other important components of or functions of vitamin B6, it has to do with cardiovascular health. And throughout this, we're going to talk about homocysteine. Homocysteine is really a byproduct of the metabolism of methionine, and the homocysteine has been linked, high levels of homocysteine has been linked to cardiovascular disease, but there's not really a clear causative relationship. And taking a look here, we have the same RDA for men and women. A great source of vitamin B6 are garbanzo beans. Less sources would be things like chicken. There is some amount in chicken breast, but not very much. But garbanzo beans would be a great source of vitamin B6. Now, the next vitamin that we're going to talk about is folate. Folate you may have heard of before. Folate is involved especially in DNA synthesis, red blood synthesis, and also cell division. This is really important for cell division, especially very early on in embryos. Folate, also sometimes referred to as folic acid, is going to be very important, especially for women who are pregnant or who may become pregnant. We'll see that in just a moment. So here is folate. This is in micrograms. Notice this is in micrograms. And some of the sources, things like lentils, have a very good amount of folate. Broccoli, even cooked spaghetti and white rice have a good amount of folate. Now, in terms of the pregnancy, women who are pregnant or may become pregnant or planning to become pregnant really need to have a huge increase, nearly a twofold increase in the amount of folate they take in. And one of the reasons for that is in order to successfully do cell division and have cells divide properly, a good amount of folate is needed. And when pregnancy occurs, the beginning part of pregnancy is when one cell fuses with another cell and those cells start dividing. One of the big problems with a lack of folate or low folate levels is what's called neural tube defects. And neural tube defects can lead to improper closing of what will eventually become the spinal cord. Now, unfortunately, the increased need for folate is critical very early. Usually before women even know she's pregnant. So women of childbearing age who are sexually active and could become pregnant are often recommended to consume an extra 400 micrograms of folate a day. And if we flip back, that's double or 2 times the RDA for non-pregnant or non-able to become pregnant women and for men. Now, folate has also been linked to vascular disease, and we're going to look at later on vitamin B12, but both folate and vitamin B12 are required for the breakdown of an amino acid called homocysteine. And if we take a look over here, this is methionine. Methionine is important, it's one of the essential amino acids. When this is broken down, homocysteine is a breakdown product of that, but then that homocysteine can be converted back to methionine. In order for that to happen, we need both vitamin B12 and folate. So if we're lacking the vitamin B12 and the folate, we may see increases in homocysteine, and that's been linked with a greater risk of cardiovascular disease and even cerebrovascular disease. Now, the last big problem with the folate deficiency is what's called macrocytic or megaloblastic anemia. Right? This is a type of anemia, and we'll talk about a few different kinds of anemia throughout the lecture today. But this type of anemia is caused by a severe folate deficiency, and what we see here are the red blood cells they appear enlarged, and what it really is the way red blood cells are formed. They start off as a precursor, a very large cell called a megaloblast. And that megaloblast divides and changes, and it produces the other kinds of blood cells. But in this case, when we have a folate deficiency, because it hampers cell division, that megaloblastic cell cannot divide as it's supposed to become a fully functioning, mature red blood cell. So looking at the blood, the red blood cells, are much larger than they should be because they look more like those megaloblasts. So these are considered, this is called macrocytic, macro meaning big, and cytic meaning cell. So this is big cell anemia. The problem with this, even though these cells are bigger, they have insufficient hemoglobin. So without having the hemoglobin, they can't carry the proper amount of oxygen. And then without being able to carry the proper amount of oxygen, you get symptoms of anemia, which are weakness and fatigue, irritability, headache, mostly from the fact that there's not enough oxygen being carried. Right? So folate is definitely a very important, not just for women who are pregnant or could become pregnant, but for everyone. Folate is a very important vitamin. The next is vitamin B12. Vitamin B12 is also one that is very diverse in its functions. One thing it can do is it is a coenzyme for some of the enzymes within the body that are important in metabolic pathways. It functions as a coenzyme for blood formation. It is required for nerve functioning, and if you read at the beginning of the chapter the case study of the elderly gentleman who was a vegan who suddenly had a massive change in his health history, you'd see that was from a vitamin B deficiency. Right? Now, vitamin B12 is found only in animal-based foods, so therefore people who take very strict vegan lifestyle or who eat only vegetarian diet often have problems due to vitamin B12 deficiencies, and therefore are recommended to take either oral or injected forms. Some of the things that can occur with vitamin B12 deficiencies are things like what's called pernicious anemia, a different form of anemia. Okay. Now, if you take a look, individuals who eat food from animals often do not have to worry about vitamin B12 deficiencies because many products that are animal products have at least the recommended amount of vitamin B12. Notice this here is in micrograms. Okay. Now, another way that there is a deficiency is not that you're not taking in enough vitamin B12, but that you're not able to absorb it. And some reasons why you might not be able to absorb a vitamin has to do with a low pH in the stomach. This is a common problem in individuals who are aging, in the aging population, where the ability of the stomach to actually break down so things can be absorbed drops. There's also something called intrinsic factor, intrinsic meaning within, and this intrinsic factor is important in allowing the vitamin B12 that we take in to become usable. So all of this, you should also check out the vitamin B12 absorption animation on Mastering or in Blackboard. Now, in terms of the pernicious anemia, pernicious, the word pernicious, this means causing great harm. So vitamin B12 deficiencies can lead to this pernicious or nearly very damaging, if you will, anemia. And this is from people who either have very low B12 in their diet or who are unable to take in or absorb the vitamin B12 that they might be taking in because of low acid production or a lack of that intrinsic factor. The next of the B vitamins then is pantothenic acid. And pantothenic acid, this is one of the components of fatty acid metabolism. This is really important as a good amount of our dietary energy comes from are fatty acids. This is found in many different places. If you've ever heard of the Pantheon, this means all over or many. If we look at the sources, the AI, the acceptable intake for men and women, is the same. Here we have this in milligrams. Once again, that whole grain total cereal, being a fortified and enriched cereal, it has more than the AI. But then certain things here, we have quite a variety of different sources that we can take this in. There are very few deficiencies in this, so there's not much recorded in terms of what deficiencies could arise. The next of the B vitamins is biotin. And biotin, interestingly, is very important in gluconeogenesis. And gluconeogenesis is the process of making glucose from non-glucose sources or non-carbohydrate sources. Biotin content has not readily been reported for many foods. The deficiencies of biotin include things like hair thinning, loss of hair color, rashes, but deficiencies are actually quite rare. The deficiencies are usually due to a blockage of the body to absorb biotin because, oddly enough, raw eggs bind biotin and prevent it from being absorbed. Now, most people do not eat a lot of raw egg white, specifically raw egg whites. So the biotin that is able to be, the biotin that is consumed is often going to be absorbed. Biotin is usually found in very high content in things like liver and eggs yolks. So it's kind of interesting if you eat an entire egg. If it's cooked, then you're taking in a good amount of biotin. If it's raw, because of the raw egg white, then the biotin is going to be blocked. Right. Biotin also can be produced by some of the intestinal flora in the gut, but however, it doesn't seem to have very high bioavailability. So that is an overview of those B vitamins. So once again, just to quickly sum up, if you refer back to table 10.1 on page 330 in the textbook, we had thiamine, which was vitamin B1, riboflavin, vitamin B2, niacin, vitamin B6, folate or folic acid, vitamin B12, pantothenic acid, and then biotin. Now the next important nutrient that relates to energy is choline. Now, choline is not a true vitamin. It's a vitamin-like substance. And one of the things that's very important in it is going to accelerate the synthesis and release of acetylcholine. And acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter that's involved in many functions, but really important in muscle movement and memory storage. So when your neurons are talking to your muscles, or when neurons are talking to other neurons, oftentimes they are releasing the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. And in order for the acetylcholine to be synthesized and properly released, the vitamin-like choline is necessary. Okay. Choline is also important in homocysteine metabolism, which we mentioned before. High levels of homocysteine are related to cardiovascular disease. So some of the sources that are very good in this would be things like milk, liver, eggs, and peanuts. These are all good sources of choline. And deficiencies often can lead to an accumulation or buildup of fat in the liver. Now, for the most part, from dietary sources alone, it's very difficult to have toxicity. However, this choline can, if taken in a supplement form, it can lead to toxicity, including a fishy body odor, vomiting and salivation, sweating, and very low blood pressure. Right? So that would be choline. Now, the trace mineral iodine is critical for thyroid hormone synthesis. Okay, now the thyroid hormones do a huge range of control in the body, including things like regulating body temperature, growth, metabolic rate. The thyroid, any sort of thyroid dysfunction, has very widespread effects on the body. So even though iodine has really only one job, and that job is to allow for the synthesis of thyroid hormones, the lack of or the overabundance of iodine can actually lead to a whole slew of problems because of the many functions of the thyroid hormones. For the most part, excess iodine can lead to what's called a goiter, and a goiter is when you have an enlarged thyroid, where the thyroid is trying to function too much, so it gets really large. Strangely enough, that is the same symptomology of an iodine deficiency. So a hypothyroid state, when the thyroid is once again working too hard because it's not getting the right feedback, can also lead to a goiter. So thyroid disease, thyroid dysfunction is actually very difficult to look at and diagnose. For the most part, the sources of iodine in the diet, some saltwater fish and shrimp, but most individuals take in their iodine from iodized salt. So when you go to, make your next salad or dinner or whatnot, take a look at the salt that you use and see if the salt you use is labeled iodized salt. Nearly all of the salt sold in the United States, table salt, is iodized salt. Now, deficiencies in iodine can have a huge impact if they occur in a pregnant woman. So a woman who is pregnant and has an iodine deficiency can lead to something called cretinism, and cretinism is a form of mental retardation that is due to a lack of iodine in the developing embryo during development. The next trace mineral is chromium, and chromium is very important in that it enhances the ability of insulin to transport glucose from the bloodstream into the cells. So if you remember the job of insulin, insulin's job is to get glucose that's in the blood into the cells where it can be used. The chromium also has a role in immune function and growth, as well as metabolism of RNA and DNA. Now, there's very little chromium that's stored in the body. And there are many good ways to get chromium into the body, including things like mushrooms and prunes and dark chocolate and nuts. So lacking chromium seems to be problematic in that it would inhibit glucose absorption in body cells. You should take a read on page 345, the nutrition myth or fact about chromium supplementation and the effect on body composition. Now, manganese is also a trace mineral. It is part of a coenzyme that is involved in energy metabolism. It's also part of the antioxidant enzyme superoxide dismutase, which we looked at in one of the previous chapters when we talked about oxidation and antioxidants. Manganese is going to be also important in the formation of urea, which is the primary component of urine when we're ridding our body of nitrogenous wastes. There are many whole grain foods that are good sources of manganese. So things like pineapple and pine nuts, raspberries, brown rice. Manganese toxicity usually does not occur in terms of dietary intake of manganese. However, it can occur if you are exposed to manganese in sources other than dietary sources. So things like drinking water that has very high minerals and specifically manganese in it, or working in some sort of hazardous occupation where you're exposed to manganese, then you can lead to toxicity. It's not very common to have toxicity due to dietary intake. And some of the symptoms of a deficiency, though, deficiencies would be impaired growth and reproductive function, impaired glucose and lipid metabolism, as well as things like skin rashes. Now, just taking a quick look at some of the sources. So simply things like canned pineapple, pine nuts, Raisin Bran cereal, these all provide nearly the AI for men and the AI for women. All right, once again, garbanzo beans. We mentioned the garbanzo beans earlier. Garbanzo beans had were a very good source of vitamin B6. They were also a good source of manganese. Garbanzo beans, also called chickpeas. The next major mineral is sulfur. Right, sulfur is an important component of both thiamine and biotin, which are some of the B vitamins we talked about. Sulfur is an important part of certain amino acids as well, the amino acids methionine and cysteine. And in those amino acids that helps to form these bonds that cross in the molecules and help to stabilize the protein structure. Sulfur is going to be very important in terms of allowing the liver to do detox, which is one of the important jobs that the liver does, to detox the body of alcohol and various drugs. Now, for the most part, we do not need to take sulfur in separately. There is no sulfur supplementation. The protein that we consume in our diets has enough sulfur already in those amino acids for the use in other amino acids. So there is no dietary recommended intake necessary for sulfur. So if we could just quickly recap, when we take a look at these, nutrients that are important in energy metabolism, we had choline, which is not actually a vitamin, but it's vitamin-like, iodine, chromium, and manganese, which were all trace minerals, and then finally sulfur, which is considered a major mineral. Now this chapter has a second part, which is about the blood, right? And so what is important in blood? So let's just shift gears here for a minute. We're no longer talking about energy metabolism, and now we're going to talk about the role of blood in maintaining health. So just to quickly talk about what blood is. We all know what blood is, but let's just review a few things. One of the important things to remember is that blood is the only fluid tissue in the body. And that it functions in transport. That's really what blood is for. It transports oxygen and nutrients to the cells, and it also removes waste products from cells. Now, in terms of the components of blood, we have four main components, four main parts in our whole blood. We have our erythrocytes, which are the red blood cells. Those are the workers that actually carry the oxygen throughout the body. Then we have leukocytes. Those are the white blood cells, and those are part of the immune system. The platelets, these are going to be important in blood clotting, and these are just cell fragments. And then finally, all of these cell and cell components float around in a fluid called plasma. And if you take whole blood and you separate it out, you'd see about 55% is the fluid portion, or the plasma, 45% are the red blood cells, and then less than 1% are the platelets and the white blood cells. Table 10.2, which is on page 347, lists the important nutrients that we're going to talk about. Some we've already talked about, so we've already talked about folate and vitamin B12, so just review those separately. So the first vitamin that we'll talk about is vitamin K. Now, vitamin K is one of those fat-soluble vitamins. Vitamin K is an important coenzyme for the synthesis of proteins that are involved in blood clotting. We do have within our bodies intestinal bacteria that produce vitamin K, and interestingly, in many hospitals, newborn infants are given a single injection of vitamin K because they lack the intestinal flora, the intestinal bacteria, to start producing vitamin K on their own. The best sources of vitamin K are green leafy vegetables. And in terms of what vitamin K does specifically, it's going to act as a coenzyme, and it's going to consist of a few different proteins. Now, the coagulation of blood is quite complex. Some of the important things are things called prothrombin, as well as the clotting factors, and these work together. Without vitamin K, the blood would not properly clot. So it could either be delayed, where you have what's called increased clotting time, where it takes longer for the blood to clot, or clotting would not work at all. Now, the next mineral that we're going to talk about is iron, and we've all heard of iron before. Iron is considered a trace mineral, and the importance that we'll talk about here is the function of iron in the protein hemoglobin and myoglobin. Hemoglobin is the oxygen-carrying portion within the blood, and myoglobin is the same job, but specifically within muscle cells. Iron, though, also functions as what's called a cytochrome, and then these cytochromes require iron as a coenzyme, and those cytochromes are electron carriers that are going to be important in the energy production from both carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. So let's just take a quick look at where we see iron in hemoglobin. So this would be a hemoglobin molecule, and the hemoglobin molecule has this heme group. And if we take a closer look at this heme group here, this is a very complex molecule, and what we see at the very center here is our iron atom. Okay, so we have one iron atom in each of the heme groups, and when we look at this Fe here, that is the atomic symbol for iron, just so you know that that's iron, that's right there. Okay, so we need iron in these heme groups inside of the hemoglobin so that this hemoglobin molecule can actually carry oxygen. Now we can store iron in our body as either ferritin or homosiderin. And this is usually stored within the liver, the bone marrow, the intestinal mucosa, or the spleen. Now, the sources of iron in foods actually vary from whether or not we're talking about animal-based foods or plant-based foods. And so we have what's called heme iron. And heme iron is iron that's already in the heme form. This comes solely from animal-based foods, and it's more absorbable. So when we're consuming a diet, we can absorb more of the heme iron that we're taking in than what's called the non-heme iron. Right? And so the non-heme iron, this is iron that's not already in the form of hemoglobin or myoglobin. This comes from both plant or animal-based foods, and it's less absorbable. In terms of how much we should take in and the sources, we take a look over here. We see that men have a much lower iron RDA than women do, and part of this has to do with menstruation. During the monthly menses, women lose a huge amount of blood, and in doing so lose a huge amount of iron. So need to have a much higher iron intake. So things like canned clams provide a huge amount of iron, but many other things, spinach has a high amount, and lentils have higher amounts of iron as well. Right? Once again, chickpeas, or those garbanzo beans, also have a good amount. Now, there are some special circumstances that can affect iron status. So take a look at this. This has to do with some individuals who may have improved or diminished iron status, because simply how much iron you're taking in isn't the only thing to take into account. You also have to consider how much iron you're able to absorb, right? And you absorb iron better when you have low iron stores. Now, that doesn't mean that you necessarily need any sort of supplementation. Iron supplements, you can overdose on iron. One of the things that happens when people do any sort of iron supplementation is often constipation is a very common side effect of iron supplementation. However, in small children, children under the age of 6, iron poisoning is actually a very common cause of death. It's the most common cause of poisoning deaths in children under the age of 6 is iron overdose. You can also have toxicity to iron, and there can be delayed treatment of iron toxicity. So you can have an iron toxicity that can have prolonged effects. Now, there are some people who should not take supplemental. We've mentioned hemochromatosis before. Hemochromatosis is a genetic disorder in which the body stores too much and absorbs too much iron as it is. So people with hemochromatosis should never do iron supplementation. Now, believe it or not, iron deficiency is the most common nutrient deficiency in the world. The people who are most at risk are the young, women, and especially pregnant women. So stage 1 is when iron stores are depleted, and there's usually no physical symptomology here, so people often don't even know that they're in stage 1 iron depletion. In stage 2, this is where you have iron deficiency erythropoiesis. Erythropoiesis is the production of red blood cells. So in this case, the red blood cells are being produced, but with lacking iron. So therefore, there is not going to be enough iron transport. The molecule that does iron transport is called transferrin. We're seeing reduced production of heme here. And then what is going to occur is this is where we're going to start seeing some of the effects. Finally, then we can go to iron deficiency anemia. Right? In this case, the red blood cell production is going to be decreased. There's going to be decreased production of heme, and we start to see those anemic symptoms, things like pale skin, fatigue. Those same symptoms we saw in the different kinds of anemia before, but in this case, this kind of anemia is called microcytic anemia. Right, microcytic anemia. Now the red blood cells are too small because they don't carry enough hemoglobin. Right, so that's the third kind of anemia that we have talked about, all with different causes and slightly different treatments then. The next mineral then is zinc, and zinc is one of the trace minerals. Zinc is a very important cofactor in hemoglobin production. It helps then indirectly in supporting the transport of oxygen to our cells. Zinc is also part of the superoxide dismutase antioxidant enzyme system, which we talked about in a previous chapter. Zinc also has an important role in how proteins fold into their biologically active forms, and that has very kind of huge, diverse effects throughout the body. So depending on how biologically active molecules can fold, it's going to be critical for things like cell replication and growth. And it's been shown that zinc deficiency can lead to changes that don't lead to critical normal growth and sexual maturation. Zinc is also important in the functioning of the immune system. And one of the interesting things, if you read the nutrition debate on page 357, has to do with taking zinc supplementation to fight the common cold. So please read that nutrition debate. In terms of the amount of zinc needed, is different again for women versus men. Something like raw oysters have lots of zinc in them. And then we have some of the other foods that would provide zinc in the diet. Now, you can take too much zinc if you take it in the supplement form, and those would be the symptoms would be things like pain and cramps and nausea. And some people take zinc to try and fight colds, as you can see in the nutrition debate box. And what's interesting is if you take in too much zinc, it can actually lead to downregulation of the immune system, is one of the side effects of zinc supplementation, or over-supplementation. The truth is, true deficiencies of zinc are very uncommon in the United States, but if they are usually due to more severe issues. The last of the trace minerals we will talk about is copper. And copper is a cofactor for energy metabolism. It's also important in collagen production. And if you remember, collagen and elastin, these were both important in the function or the production of the skin and how the skin works. This is also required for iron transport, so it helps to facilitate the transport of iron. And in terms of the recommended amounts of copper, once again, those shiitake mushrooms and garbanzo beans, the chickpeas, both of these have good amounts of that. Here's the RDA for both men and women for copper, and this is given in milligrams. Now, there have not been many studies on toxicity in humans, simply because it's very difficult to take in too much copper. It's not really readily available as a single supplement form, and from food sources, you would have to eat quite a bit of the particular food source to overdose or to get a toxicity. And then also copper deficiency is rare. So that even though copper is an important trace mineral, it's not one that is really problematic in terms of people taking in too little or too much.